Hello, everybody. I'm Susan Nolan from Seton Hall University in New Jersey in the US. I'm also the current past president of the Society for the Teaching of Psychology. And I'm excited to be here today to talk about how to internationalize your teaching and learning in psychology. And I wanted to start out by thanking the folks at PsyChi, of which I am a member, for inviting me today, and particularly Alice Christian, Kevin Germain, and Martha Zlakovich for all their help with this. So before I start, I just want to give a caveat that I am coming from a position of being someone born in the US. I have had the opportunity to live outside the US on several occasions, including in France, Canada, and Bosnia and Herzegovina. But I clearly don't have, I have my limited perspective in coming to this. So that's a caveat of the things I'm choosing to share, or that I'm prioritizing, certainly are embedded in that. And also I'm a white, cisgender, heterosexual woman. All of these things are part of where this comes from. Certainly people from different backgrounds will have different things to share. And in fact, I would love to hear from anybody. My email is on the last slide, but it's also my name, susan.nolan@shu.edu. Always happy for new ideas. And I'm also very happy to share my slides because there are a lot of resources in them. So just send me an email and I can share the slides with you. So psychology is hugely popular around the globe. In fact, the US used to dominate. As recently as the 1980s, 80% of psychologists in the world were in the US. And more recently, it's more like 21 to 24%. And that's not because we have fewer of us who are psychologists in the US. It's because, in fact, we have more. It's because it's grown exponentially around the world. And APA, the American Psychological Association's 5 guidelines include as their third one, ethical and social responsibility in a diverse world. So this is something that, for those of us in the US, the APA's guidelines for the undergraduate psychology major values. And I know from having been on the most recent guidelines committee and gotten input from some of our international colleagues that the APA's guidelines are used by some of our international colleagues as well. So this is very much emphasized. So I want to start with an example of the ways in which we can think about psychology from a number of our subdisciplines and with respect to a number of different countries at once. So currently about 281 million people are living in a country that was not the country they were born in. This is a beautiful graph from the Atlantic. The graph is a little bit old, about 10 years, not quite 10 years old, 7 years old, but it gives you just this sort of stunning graphic of where people are coming from and where they're going to. And so when we think about that, oh, and I should also add about 100 million of those people are either internally displaced, refugees, asylum seekers. And that's, a huge global challenge. So this example really gets students thinking about this interconnectedness of our world. And this is the full graphic. So there are lots of examples. This, for example, is Doha. She lives in Jersey City. I know her through a neighbor/volunteer organization I work with. And she's just a wonderful example of someone whose Syrian culture is very important to her, but she's also very much integrating into her new life as a refugee in the United States. And she's selling her amazing cheese in the local area. And she is a perfect example of what we have long talked about with respect to research on acculturation. She's an example of someone who is integrating. She has a positive connection with her original culture and a connection with her new culture. And so this is thought to be the best way to acculturate. So this is the long-standing information. And yet recent research has upended this idea. In fact, the ways in which we thought that immigrants should adapt don't really have a whole lot of evidence. So what's really interesting, and I'm not going to dig deep into this research, but to point out just a couple of things. The authors note that their findings have considerable implications because so many countries around the world have so many immigrants who are present. But what they point out, and I'm giving you the whole quote, but the white part is the really important part. what these researchers point out is that what's more important than these individual factors, like Doha's work and keeping connected to her original culture and her work in integrating into her new culture, that is less important. And certainly what she's doing is amazing. What's more important are the contextual factors, things that we as a society can be doing, the receiving societies can and should be doing, looking at discrimination, language barriers, other barriers, lack of social support, etc. So this moves the burden on the people who are immigrating to the people who are in the receiving societies, which is a real paradigm shift. So this story, and just Welcome Home is the group that I know Doha through, and this is a case where the community is trying to remove barriers for refugees and asylum seekers. This story kind of highlights, oh, and one last thing about the story is that the researchers use open practices, which is something I think is really important, just internationalizing, allowing us to kind of see what was done, see the pre-registration, see the data, and this transparency, I think, lends itself to more cross-national collaborations if you can just dig in and look at their data, et cetera. So again, this story kind of highlights a number of different areas of psychology, how they are things that we might be talking about in our classes anyway, and how they directly tie to global challenges, global trends, and even, zooming down to the individuals in our own communities like Doha. Where can we do this kind of storytelling knitted with international trends, international challenges, and psychological science? I would argue just about any course that we teach. These are ones where I could readily come up with examples of ways in which we can do this, but I'm sure there are other courses that you could think of as well. I also want to add that while I'm presenting, I can't see anything but my slides, but I'm not going to be talking the whole time, and we're going to have a chance for Q&A, and I'm going to stop sharing at that point so I can see everybody. And it's been suggested that we have questions that are in the chat, and then I can read them and answer them. And again, I'm always happy to engage after the fact. Please reach out to me at any time. And yes, even research methods and statistics, and I'll give a couple examples of ways to do that later. So just briefly, I want to talk about the fact that the US educational system, and certainly PsychI is international, and people watching this might be from a number of different places, but I know a bulk of the PsychI membership is US based. And again, that's my viewpoint. I think it's important to think about international models of education and how they can inform what we're doing, even in our own classrooms. And if you're a student watching this, I hope you'll get some tips about how you, even if your instructor is not pulling in the international angles, how you can do it in your own assignments. So this is a paper I wrote a couple years ago on frameworks for competencies for US psychologists engaging internationally. And there are, in this paper, foundational competencies, which look at attitudes like cultural humility and openness, but there are also specific competencies for practice, for research, for consulting and policymaking, and for teaching. And looking at this concept of you have to have knowledge, you have to have skills, it involves an attitude, and then we give different examples of how to do this. So if you're teaching in another country or culture, you want to know how that pedagogy and curricula are understood and that local context. And so you need to develop skills, which are strategies for learning about what's going on differently in that country. You have to have an attitude of openness and cultural humility. And then you have to think about adapting the content and adapting your pedagogical techniques. And I would argue that these are important things to do, even if we're not teaching in another country, because we often have international students in our classrooms. So learning more about how other systems of education work can change our current way of working. And by the way, that picture in the background is of a building at the University of Banja Luka in Bosnia and Herzegovina, where I worked for a semester a few years ago. So the European Union has a European higher education area. The Bologna process is the name for it because of an initial congress that was in the city of Bologna in Italy. And most countries in Europe are part of this European higher education area. I just want to talk very briefly about what's different about that compared to the US system. So the Bologna process the main things are these 7 indicators. 4 of them are things that we already do in the US. We've got different levels of education. We have a 4-year undergrad, often a 2-year master's, and then a doctorate. They have a 3+2+ doctorate, but very similar. And when Bologna was implemented, they adopted these things. Not everybody had these previously. They have a credit system, much like we do in the US. Active and applied learning didn't used to be prioritized, and it used to be very lecture-based, but now it is. And frequent assessments, meaning in the past, in some European universities, you might get one big exam at the end of a semester, or even at the end of a whole year, without lots and lots of chances to show what you're learning. So those are things that we already know about. But what's really cool and different about this is that this area has standards. They don't use that word. They use words like harmonizing, because you can't make a one-size-fits-all. But these harmonized standards, in quotes, promote mobility across countries and across universities, which is something that we don't have. For example, if you wanted to come into, until recently had a master's in experimental psychology at Seton Hall, we would actually look at your transcript to see if you had taken certain courses. And if you hadn't, then we would say, oh, you need to take it. Like, that just doesn't exist when you have this kind of a harmonized model. The outcomes are connected to the market. So employment is very much a driver of the development of curricula. And we just don't think about that enough. We're starting to more, but we're just sort of like, here's what we're doing, and now go find a job, as opposed to, well, what are the jobs out there, and what kinds of skills are they looking for, and how can a psychology undergraduate major provide that? And then the assessments tied to those market-driven outcomes. The other thing that's really different is the stakeholders. So in the US, we think about, okay, our faculty members, we're going to develop a program, we're going to think about our students, maybe we'll talk to our alumni. But in this European higher education area in Bologna, they engage very actively employers, business leaders, leaders of other types of organizations, non-governmental organizations, government leaders, and the general public. So, you know, what is it that we hope to get out of these students that we are educating in our country? It's important to note, and this is a great quote from Elizabeth Colucci, Bologna is not a model for export, it is a European solution to European needs. So I'm not saying anybody should be adopting it wholesale, but many places in the world, all of these places that are in color, have developed European higher education area style processes, often with funding from the European Union, to start to develop these kinds of consortia. And even Canada and Australia, who are not in color here, are doing these kinds of programs. There's an Australian qualifications framework, for example, that is partly driven by Bologna. You'll see that really the only 2 major countries in the world that aren't doing this are Russia and the United States. So this is a place where I think, you know, again, I'm talking big picture, but when we're thinking about our own classrooms, I think we can start thinking more about this external stakeholders and how the outcomes for our classes are driven by thinking about where our students are going to end up. And the Bologna process and European psychological Eurosci is I'm not going to get into that, that's at the graduate level. What can they learn from us? They don't have the same breadth in liberal arts education that we do. So breadth in terms of the many disciplines of psychology, it's much more focused on becoming a clinician, and there isn't this sort of gen ed requirement. So these are things I think are very, my opinion is that they're very personally important. I find them very important to our educational system in the United States, and I would love to see more of that. And many people in the EU would like to see more of that too. What can we learn from them? So thinking about where our students end up, and if you're a student, where do you want to end up, and what skills can help you get there? What do you need to succeed once you're there? How can we as instructors, how can you as a student look at getting the skills that you need to succeed where you hope you're going to end up? And in the long term, we need to think more about mobility within the United States among our programs and across countries. So a couple of quick frameworks before I get into some specific suggestions that hopefully you can implement in your own classes. So one of them is psychological literacy. And this is something that Jackie Kearney, I wrote a paper with her and some colleagues recently. Jackie she's in Australia, and she's been a really big driver of work on using psychological literacy as a framework for undergraduate psychology education. And the original, oh, by the way, psychological literacy, the idea of it came about through a cross collaboration between Australian and US psychologists. But the idea that we, those of us who are trained in psychology, can ethically apply our psychological skills and knowledge in a way that benefits us in our personal lives, in our jobs, in our lives in the community, across everything. So not just thinking about preparing ourselves for jobs, but thinking about preparing ourselves for life. And I think we can think about a lot of skills that we develop in psychology. Just off the bat, our skills at scientific thinking and understanding research methods and statistics to help avoid, say, misinformation. If we're learning about something that's relevant to our own lives, maybe a health issue we're having, to be able to think about that in our jobs, of course, in our communities, to be good citizens in a global way, which is the second one. So understanding global citizenship is understanding global interrelatedness and the capacity to live, work, and contribute positively as a member of global communities. Also want to shout out to Kelly Haynes-Mendez, who's done work in this area. Lastly, and this is something that I'm learning more and more about, is the idea of decolonizing psychology. I'm not going to talk about a lot about that today because this is not yet my expertise at all. I'm learning a lot about how to do this, and it's something that I'm on sabbatical this year, and I'm really that's one of the things I really want to learn more about. So how to better ask questions about who is telling the story of psychology and who has the power to construct and disseminate knowledge about psychology and whose voices are being included in that story. So these are the questions that we need to be asking when we're decolonizing. And this is from an article written by Ayurdi Dar. So I'm going to go over some smaller things that we can do and then some bigger things that we can do. Some of the smaller things, and they're not small at all, they're really important, but they're things that are more easily implemented. And the first is this idea of admitting that most of us in the US are weird, which I'll go over that acronym in a second for those of you who haven't heard it. But this book by Robert Guthrie, Even the Rat Was White, gives us a sense of the limitations of psychological science as it exists, as it has existed. It's starting to change, but there's still a long way to go. So WEIRD stands for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And a huge, huge majority of psychological science that's been published over the decades has been from researchers who are from weird places, in journals that are based in weird places, with editors and reviewers from weird places, and with participants from weird places. So just starting by acknowledging this in our classes and starting to try to work to broaden what we're including in our classes beyond weird work. There's some pushback against weird. So this article talks about the fact that weird is limited. So it's a backronym at worst. So meaning like, oh, let's find words that match with weird because we think that's a good word. It doesn't talk about race and ethnicity. Some people sometimes use the W for white, but it's Western. And it also lacks specificity. So it's not perfect, yet it's a good way to start. It's easily remembered, and it's a way to kickstart the conversation. So one of the things we can ask when we're teaching is whose voices are heard. And I think about my colleague at Seton Hall University, Marianne Lloyd, when she teaches research methods, she explicitly includes research that is about race and ethnicity and discrimination, and includes researchers who are from marginalized groups. And I remember her talking about a young Latino guy in her class who was like, wow, this is a guy, we're reading a paper by a professor at Rutgers University, which is right up the road in New Jersey, who is also Latino. So someone that this student could see himself in. So making a point to include a wider range of voices, noticing who the participants, the questions, the researchers, the gatekeepers are, no matter what type of class you're teaching, is really important. So I also use the news. I start my classes with psychology in the news with something I've seen in the news. I do this in every one of my classes every day, and I just stick it up. We don't go into depth, but look, here's where psychology is showing up. And then in most of my classes, I have an extra credit assignment where students can send me an example, and then I share it with the class, giving that student credit. So they start to notice that psychology is everywhere. And of course, it depends on what the course. If it's intro to psych, it's very broad. If it's abnormal psych, which we have recently renamed mental health at Seton Hall, it's related to that, but there's always stuff out there. So just giving you some examples of where you can find international ideas. I don't know if you know about the museum, today's front pages, and easy to find if you Google museum and today's front pages. It has front pages from newspapers around the world. Of course, they're not all in English, but you can, even if you don't speak a particular language, you can kind of see just from the pictures what they're highlighting, what's important in that country. And they also have lesson plans and all kinds of things on their website. So it's just a really cool tool for getting a sense of what's going on around the world. And you can sort by region, you can click on newspapers from a map. There's a list, there's different ways you can look at it. And here are ones from, you can see from Asia. There are lots of great resources from the United Nations. UNESCO has stories all the time of things that are going on. So it might not even be something that's in the news per se, but it's ways in which there are social and behavioral science issues that the UN is engaging with. The UN Sustainable Development Goals, almost all of these have something to do with psychology. And this is just such a great tool if you're teaching statistics and you're looking for data to use. What you can do with this sdgtracker.org is you can click on one of these. So for example, if you click on gender equality, which is number 5 in the top row, you get a whole bunch of different findings and graphs and maps. And so in this example, does the law mandate non-discrimination based on gender in hiring? And so you can see which countries around the world have that law. And if we were live on the internet, I could click that little triangle in the lower left, and it would show how this has changed between 2009 and 2015. So the data, however much data they have for how many years, you can do that sort of interactive. And you can click, you can see in the upper right, world, do you want to see your region? And now this is what's really, really cool. You can then download the chart if you wish, or you can download the full data set that was used to make that chart. So what a great way to have cool data from around the world that's, relatively recent, because they update it as they get new data. So that's a really great tool. There's also ICOPE, which is the International Council of Psychology Educators. There's lots of great resources there. And again, very happy to share these slides with all of these resources on them. SPICY, the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues, has a teaching and mentoring committee and tons of materials for teaching about social issues. Really, really rich set of resources. You can use your own, meaning your class's international experiences. I teach a class in international psychology, and I start by asking everybody to share their own international experiences. And I tell them, you may not have even been overseas anywhere. I grew up outside of Boston, and the only country I'd ever been to prior to being an adult after college was Canada, because we could drive to it. So I know that many people in the United States have not traveled to other countries, and yet we've all had international experiences. You've had friends from another place. Maybe you live in a community where there's a lot of people from a certain immigrant group. Maybe this is in Jersey City. This is our little India. So you can go into this neighborhood and every single store, every single restaurant is Indian. So there are ways to have these international experiences no matter what. And I encourage students to think about those and bring them into the classroom too. Diversifying names in your examples is really important and really easy to do. This is from Wikipedia, just the list of most popular given names. So here you see Algeria and Egypt and lists of names. They have the number 1 names. In some cases, you can see they have number 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. They have most popular male names, most popular female names. And then once you diversify the names, you can diversify the photos very easily. So for example, let's say you take the name Hamza and you look it up in Google Images and you get pictures of people named Hamza, and you can specifically ask for ones with a Creative Commons license so that you can diversify photos. I also want to call out 2 of my favorite sources for photos, for free high quality photos. Unsplash.com is one of them, and just wonderfully diverse photos of diverse people. If you're trying to internationalize your examples, you'll get lots of ideas from unsplash.com, and again, free to use. And another one is pexels.com, and again, very high quality, gorgeous photos, and lots of diversity. You can include international examples and research in assignments. So as a faculty member, you might require that an assignment if your students are being asked to cite peer-reviewed journal articles. Make one of them or a percentage of them have to be from another country outside the U.S. Or if you're in another country, outside of your own country. If you're a student, go out of your way to do that. If you're not required to, that doesn't mean you can't. And remember that US examples are international examples too. In my international psychology class in particular, sometimes I'll have a student be talking about something in the US and they'll be like, wait, that's not international. It's like, well, we're in the world too, and we're interconnected too. So our examples connect to global ideas and research as well. To do that, I love this series from slate.com. If it happens there, it doesn't update all the time. Like I think the most recent one is 2018, but some of them are sort of perennials. And one of the ones I love to use is about the Super Bowl. And the goal of these articles, if it happened there, is to show how it would be written about by international media. So how do we look through a lens from another culture? And I'll just, I'll let you read a little bit of this. I love her, except for in a couple of instances, feet do not touch the ball. Of course, the Washington football team has now changed its name, so that is no longer current, but you can get a sense of the ways in which these articles, if it happened there, can really get us thinking from an outsider perspective about our own country. So what are bigger things we can do? We really, I think, need to transform our curricula. And 3 ways we can do that are integrated content, high impact practices, or HIPS for short, and real world assessment. So talk about each of them briefly in turn. So integrated content are stories like the one that I talked about at the beginning. They cut across psychology disciplines and countries. So this idea about acculturation, the research showing that the individual's efforts are far less important to doing well and adapting in a new culture than that receiving society's efforts. So that is a broad story that touches on a whole lot of different ideas and a lot of different countries as well. So trying to find those, and maybe even finding ways where you can talk with colleagues and have some of these same stories and ideas and research show up across different courses, so students can see how we think about these from different perspectives. And these are some articles I've used in my courses over the past few years. This is an article written near the beginning of the pandemic by an actual refugee living in the UK about how the early days of the pandemic in particular, where our worlds were upended, might actually allow more people to understand what it must like to be a refugee. Climate anxiety in the environment. There's so much going on in environmental psychology. The redemption of Mohammed Khalid, about a teenager who turned to extremism and how he found his way out of it. And important in many countries and contexts. We have a lot of discussion in the US right now about extremism, our own homegrown extremists, whether it's white supremacy or other kinds of extremism. Thinking about how people go down that path and how they come out of it touches on a lot of areas of psychology in a lot of countries around the world. Misinformation and some of the efforts that are occurring. There's some great work being done by fact checkers in Africa that we can learn from. And racism in the time of COVID-19 is another article that I've used in recent years. Finding examples, and these are just a few things you can subscribe to and that I follow. They're like newsletters that pop up with all kinds of really interesting ideas. One of them is the World Bank, which has a Mind, Behavior, and Development unit, and just really cool stuff about programs that are going on around the world that use psychological and behavioral science to change things. Just really, really cool stuff. And again, I'll share these slides. But you can just sign up and get on their mailing list. And they don't send a lot, but when they do, they've got cool stuff. Another is the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs, The Voice, which comes out monthly. So you can sign up to get that. And these are stories that relate to economic, social, and sustainable development policy, very much related to psychology and other social and behavioral sciences. And so, yeah, again, you can subscribe to that as well. And this is a new one, which I'm just starting to follow. I used to follow something called First Draft News, which focused on global misinformation and very much from a psychological science perspective. They are now defunct, and much of what they were doing has now transferred to Brown University in their Information Futures Lab. So I'm excited to see what they're going to do. Yeah, you can sign up for and I just did. I signed up for their bi-weekly newsletter, the lab report. So these are really interesting sources of information that we're probably not likely to get elsewhere. It's not going to show up in the traditional psychological journals. It's not going to show up in mainstream news. It's not likely to come across your social media. So this is a really, I think, great way to get examples that you can use in your classes that are probably going to be very cutting edge and very new to your students. And if you're a student, what a great way to get ideas for things you can incorporate in your classes. High impact practices and real world assessments are the other two areas. So global citizenship and action. So, here you go, high impact practices. These are all kinds of things that are captured under that umbrella of high impact practices, but one of them is diversity and global learning experiences. And, for example, PsychHi is an international organization. What about having a collaboration between classes in 2 different countries? There are ways in which those kinds of collaborations can occur to allow people to very directly have these experiences, because as we all know, not everybody has the privilege to be able to study abroad. Wouldn't it be wonderful if they did? But there are ways in which we can do that in our classes. It's a lot more work. That's why I said these are bigger things. An authentic assessment is when students are asked to do something that's real world, something meaningful that they might actually do in their lives when they're done with their undergraduate education. So authentic assessment is all of these things. It's challenging. It has some kind of an outcome, which is great because students can use that in a portfolio. It ensures transfer of knowledge. In other words, this is something we can use elsewhere. Students have to reflect. It involves metacognition, thinking about your thinking. It assesses performance in an accurate way. It's delivered in as real world of an environment as possible. Facilitates feedback and a dialogue about that feedback. And it encourages collaboration, because that's the reality is I know a lot of students and a lot of people, all of us, sometimes hate group work, but that's the way the world works. And so fostering collaborative opportunities is really important. So just a couple examples from my own classes. In a couple of my classes, I have students write an op-ed or a letter to the editor. They can choose which one they want to do. It seems like everyone would choose the letter to the editor, but often students find it's really hard to just boil it down to the 250 to 300 words. So a lot of them will go for the 500 to 700 words. So they have to pick, this is the example from my international psychology class. They have to pick a topic. Maybe the topic is, here's one from this past spring. I had a student who was an athlete who was from another country decide that her topic was going to be integration of international athletes into the NCAA in the United States in terms of mental health challenges. And so her country was the US, but it was by international students. And she chose an outlet for it, which was an NCAA. She was writing a letter to the editor, actually, and she was going to write it to the NCAA. And so she found, and everyone had to use one peer-reviewed journal article and then boil it down to write about it to a general audience. And students are welcome to send their letters or their op-eds in if they wish. Some of them do, most of them don't. But they get excited about, wow, this is a tool that I could use someday in my own civic life after I graduate. And then they have to take that same topic and turn it into an infographic. And so this is an example that one of my students did that I'm sharing with her permission. They have to create an infographic based on that same peer-reviewed journal article. And these are, again, just examples from my international psychology class. I do these kinds of things in all my classes, but in my international psychology class, groups of students have to give presentations. And it cannot be, it has to be on, again, some psychological topic that is evidence-based by something from the psychological science literature in a particular country. And they have to use a pedagogical technique that is not giving a PowerPoint presentation. So these are just examples from the past year or two of what my students have chosen to do. And they've gotten really, really creative, and they have a lot of fun with it. And also, I won't get into that here, but with group presentations, I've gotten some really great ideas from folks in the Society of the Teaching of Psychology about how to have students review each other in their group, and they know they're going to do that. And they can get dinged if everyone agrees certain students worked less than others. And interestingly, not all the time, but much of the time, the student who really didn't do as much work as the others is willing to admit it. So there are ways that I make it so that it's, social loafing is not rewarded. And this is just an example from a group that did happiness in Norway. They pretended they were a travel agency, and they created a Facebook page that was highly interactive. And so, during their presentation, all the students were on the Facebook page, and they had been engaging and doing polls and commenting and deciding if they were going to go to Norway based on the knowledge about happiness in Norway. So these are some examples of what students can do. And also, I just want to note that sometimes we think, oh, we can't assess some of the things that we're trying to inculcate in our students. How do we assess diversity-related skills, including globally? And this is an article I wrote with Jane Halloran and other colleagues about just that after the summit on the National Assessment of Psychology, SNAP. It's harder, but it can be done. And I think it's really important that we try to assess in better ways. And finally, back to psychological literacy and global citizenship. In any way we can, hold these as sort of models for how to think about designing your courses, your learning outcomes, and the assessments that are based on them. And I'm going to be thinking about them a lot more. I'm going to be in Australia from January through May in 2023, working with Jackie Cranny to think about undergraduate psychology outcomes from a more international perspective and how we might think about these concepts. I'll be there on a Fulbright scholarship. So I'm really excited to dig more into how we can do this in ways that foster international conversations among those of us teaching undergraduate psychology, so we can learn from each other. And the last thing I want to end with, US Bologna expert Clifford Edelman, who died a couple of years ago, he urged less developed countries to learn from Bologna. And he says, in this context, the US is a less developed country. We have a lot to learn from other places in the world, a lot to teach as well, of course. But I think we have a lot to learn that can help us to do a better job at making our courses more intentionally global in nature. And finally, I just want to note that this map of the world that I use as the backdrop for my opening slide and my closing slide is a more accurate representation of the world that shows just how big Africa is in comparison, say, to the US. And the typical map is Northern Hemisphere centric. And so it minimizes the size of the Southern Hemisphere countries. This map also centers Africa, whereas we tend to see maps that center the Americas. So just want to note that there are even subtle ways we can make differences in our teaching. So thank you for listening. I'm going to stop sharing my slides so that I can see all of you and see if anyone has any questions. And there's just a few of us. You can either put it in the chat, but there's so few of us. If people want to talk, I'd love to hear ideas. I'd love to hear pushback when I talk about this. I know that there's things that I'm missing, and I always love to hear the criticisms. I love the word criticism as a positive word, not a negative word. So Martha's asking, thinking of US students who might wish to study in another country but return for work, is clinical counseling the best or worst area for grad school outside of the US in terms of transferability? It is a great question. If you are in Europe, you wouldn't want to study in the US, because if you're in Europe and you get it's a professional psychologist, a practicing psychologist. It's a master's degree in Europe. And with the EuroPsy model that's built on Bologna, which I talked about earlier, you can just work anywhere. I mean, it's not quite like that, but it's relatively easy compared to if you're in the US and you get licensed in New Jersey. I live in Jersey City. From my front stoop, I can actually see the World Trade Center in the winter when there's no leaves on the trees. And yet, if I were licensed in New Jersey, I couldn't work in New York, which I can get to in like 20 minutes. So we really have a problem with mobility. I think for clinical counseling, my understanding from everything I know is that if you plan to practice in the US, you're much better off getting your doctorate in the US, unfortunately. And that's, again, why I think we need to start thinking out of the box. It's a great question. I think for many, many other types of psychology degrees, though, I think it's amazing to study in Europe or in another. I have a former student. She's German. She got her undergrad at Seton Hall, and now she's about to get her graduate degree in China. So I think that's awesome.
So it might be better to plan something like if you're a U.S. student, to start grad school in the U.S. and develop a research project you can do in another country than to try to get a degree over there.
Yeah,
unless
absolutely.
You want to stay over there.
Unless you want to stay over there. And also the Fulbright program is amazing and has funding for students to do research, students and faculty members to do research around the world. So I would encourage students to look into the Fulbright program.
Thank you.
Other questions, ideas, suggestions? Does anybody do explicitly international things in their classes that they want to share? Anything I'm missing? I know I'm missing lots. Every year I learn about something new and I'm like, oh my God.
There's the nice crowd research program with Psychi.
Yes.
People use in any Psychi class, or there's or research methods class or stats class, or it can just be a group or Psychi chapter, or a group of psychology students. And then even though you're just collecting on your campus, it's all put together with data that's being collected all over the room, all over the world, and you can use that data and analyze that data from all over the world too.
Yeah, that's really cool. I'm glad
you brought that up. Speaking of that, has the research study for this year been the topic of the research has it been out? I've been waiting for that, but I haven't seen anything.
Yes, I think it was in the digest that went out on September 6th, which of course at the moment I'm not remembering exactly what the topic is. But it's been selected and they're inviting people to participate in collecting.
Perfect. I'll check that. Thank you. Yeah. And thank you, Susan. It was quite informative.
Thanks, Cosette. I appreciate your coming. Do you have any ideas of things? Oh, here's another. Oh, Sarah, thank you. Thanks for your nice note, Sarah. Does either of you have things that you do in your classes that are explicitly international that you find work well?
Not to the extent that you do. So this was very inspiring. Will you be able to share your slides
Yes.
so we can have those resources? Okay.
I just put my email in the chat. Just shoot me an email. The pictures are big, so I'll put it in a Dropbox that you can retrieve it from.
Okay. Great. Thanks.
Happy to share the slides.
Thanks.
And if someone's watching this later, I'm happy to share the slides, whenever. And again, susan.nolan@shu.edu.
Do you think you've already shared the resources where people can obtain publications that are coming out of other countries? Because what we tend to read, what we tend to bring to our students tends to be what's published in the U.S. or maybe Canada and Britain, maybe Germany. But especially if they're not published in English, how do you even become aware, or make your students start to become aware of how much, especially the difference you're talking about, the number of psychologists over the last decade or two in the U.S. compared to other countries? Are we just missing 90% of the psychological research that's coming out?
So we're not missing 90% because English is the common language. In fact, Jules Dragons wrote an article now about maybe 15 years ago called The Problem of English Only, where he kind of outlines how people can get excluded if they don't speak English and they don't have access to, so the majority is still published in English. Even many international journals like the Plot, Psychology, Learning and Teaching, which is based in Europe, is an English language journal. A lot of times, and the editor is German. A lot, people from all over Europe, from different countries, are part of their editorial board, and yet it's English. So, and often I went to a conference in Belgrade a few years ago, and you could have either spoken Serbo-Croatian or English. So we're lucky in the sense that we do get access to a lot. We are missing some for sure, and that's growing, and that's, I think, a good thing. But I think we should not like, if something is in another language, oftentimes the abstract, a lot of journals in other languages will have at least an English abstract, so we can at least look at that to see if we're missing something important. But I think we need to be very explicit about looking at stuff that's outside of the United States. So if you're doing a search on, I don't know, if you're interested in environmental psychology and you're looking at, I don't know, climate anxiety, you might purposely use the word international or global in your search to see what pops up. I also do another activity with my students where we look at the table of contents of a journal, and I pick something like Sex Roles, which actually does a pretty good job at having international authors, because, and actually there's research on this, people from the US are more likely to say, an examination of the effects of such and such on such and such. People from other countries are more likely to say in China or in Luxembourg. We just omit it, like everyone knows. We're the worst. The people from the US are the worst. The second worst are people from Canada. But yeah, so we do that as a little activity of how we just assume we're the default. But yeah, if you do a little bit of work, it's not that hard to find good international stuff in English. There's a really exciting development. There's a few years back in Africa, they developed a new journal called Scientific African, modeled after Scientific American. And the idea was that research that wouldn't necessarily be published outside of Africa, things that were really particularly relevant to Africa would have a home. And these included a lot of things related specifically to agriculture, to, interestingly enough, this was prior to COVID, to infectious diseases, because that's a really big issue in Africa. So, I mean, if we're not getting that really amazing research that Africans are doing on infectious diseases, how does that affect our pandemic responses? So to see someplace like Scientific African exist, which is in English, is really, really cool. So yeah.
Yeah, this is certainly not my area, but now you piqued my interest a little bit. As far as what would you do to open up some reciprocity between countries?
So there are a couple of ways. So Division 52, which is the American Psychological Association's international division, has some places on their website to foster collaboration. So you can try and find people there. They also have a listserv. So sometimes you will post, hey, I'm interested in doing X. Is anyone interested in collaborating? I don't know. I'm gonna when I'm done, Martha, maybe you can jump in about collaborations that people can do beyond NICE crowd within Psychi. But there are also ways in which, like, if I'm going to a country, sometimes I'll, hit up the Department of Psychology there, and maybe there's a chance to, give a talk or meet some folks. People are often really excited to have that kind of contact. So, but Division 52 absolutely fosters that.
Good. Okay.
Martha, did you want to add any ways in which people might use Psychi to make these kinds of connections?
Yeah, we have a research advisory committee, and that webpage, if you just search for research or research advisory, it has a tab for collaborate. So of course the NICE project is on there, but also other opportunities like the ENI3 and the CRATE project, the Collaborative Replications project, are on there. And there's also a place where if you're doing something that you want to share your project to collaborate, you can advertise the opportunity. So I can put the link right to the page in the chat.
The Society for the Teaching of Psychology, just give a quick shout out to them as well. It's $25 to join STP if you are in a income level country by the OECD. But if you're in the lowest tier income wise, it's only $5 to join. And our Facebook page is free to join, and we have over 16,000 members. And if I'm remembering correctly, about 7,000 of them are from outside the US. So that is a really great place to connect with people from all over the world. So if someone had ideas on something that they wanted to collaborate on, particularly if it's teaching related or scholarship of teaching and learning related, but if it's related to the teaching of psychology in any way, it's a great place. And it's a great organization, just like Psychi is a great organization.
And just a plug for our journal too, we now allow authors whose work has been accepted for publication to add a second abstract in the language of their choice.
Cool. I love that.
Yeah. I thought the first one would be Spanish, but I believe it was Chinese.
That's awesome. That's really cool. I would love to see all journals do that, and I would eventually like to see it be required. I mean, you can't immediately require it, but wouldn't that be amazing? It's like, nope, you need to go get that professionally translated into something.
Yeah.
Yeah, great questions. Well, thank you so much for inviting me. This was really fun.